Putin has publicly refused to engage in peace talks with Kiev. Just what is his excuse for refusing to sit down with the Ukrainians? And why is it actually serving Russian objectives? Plus, we're going to talk about the American CIA providing intel to an Al-Qaeda linked group that's now running Syria. And of course, we're going to talk about the Trump administration's new Secretary of Defense for Policy, and more importantly, why he's putting a eye-watering 21 Army brigades on the chopping block. Just what is the thinking here, and what is his focus for the future of the U.S. military? We're going to talk about all that, plus, of course, the EU desperately trying to sound the alarm to get any European country to actually take its defense seriously. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into all of it. Okay, so this I thought was probably the craziest story. Putin is like, yeah, well, I'll be happy to hold negotiations with Ukraine, but not with Zelensky himself. Now, we know that regime change in Kiev was one of Putin's primary objectives in his invasion of Ukraine. And what that is code for, right, what Russia has shown as kind of its playbook is that instead of rolling into countries explicitly, what instead Russia will do is simply install puppet governments so that they function as proxies for the Russian state, but aren't actually causing the international outroar of taking over a country. And for examples, look no further than Central Asia, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. These are countries whose governments are effectively co-opted entirely by Moscow. Their people live in abject poverty. And we also see it in countries like Belarus, where Belarusian President Lukashenko is virtually a puppet of Vladimir Putin and is kind of famous for being kind of a buffoon in his own right. And so when you have this strategy, right, obviously it's backfired badly for Putin in Ukraine, where he thought he was going to go in and get rid of that pesky democratically elected government and replace it with a democratically elected government that's more favorable to him, Vladimir Putin. And that obviously has gone badly, but he's still clinging to the hope that Zelensky is going to get the boot. Now, again, the Russian propaganda point that he says is that he goes, oh, well, Zelensky is illegitimate because technically he didn't hold an election after his presidential term ended. Now, in the Ukrainian constitution, there are provisions that say, listen, if the country has been invaded, say by our large neighbor Russia, and is in a state of martial law, obviously you cannot hold elections. And so the existing government can persist as long as the state government, the Duma, permits him to do so. So Zelensky is not a dictator who's taken over the country, right? Instead, they just simply cannot hold elections. And, why do you think that could be? What could possibly be stopping the elections in Ukraine? Why could it be the 17% of the country under Russian occupation? How could you hold an election, right? What are you going to do? How are you going to get polls set up in Andriivka, Chernivka, in Mariupol? How can you get polling information there? And even if you somehow could, what are the odds that the Russian government is going to totally corrupt those elections? It's 100%, right? What would happen is they would hold elections. They'd go, wow, 100% of every voter in the occupied regions, according to Russia, says that they want to see pro-Russian candidates in charge. And that, of course, would be a total corruption of the system. So there is no way to hold free and fair elections, right? Even if you were to sit there and go, oh, well, we're only going to hold them in the unoccupied regions, you still have the same problem where, again, these people have not given up the Ukrainian citizenship. They're under occupation, and they will say, well, we're not even represented by Kiev, and it'll be taken as a sign that the central government in Kiev has abandoned this territory, and it'll be taken by, and Russia will use that to push their own propaganda. So this kind of, again, Russian talking point that sort of like holds water on the surface if you just don't think, if you just don't engage in even a little bit of critical thinking, right? You don't need more data. You just have to think through a problem like one extra step. And then you go, oh yeah, that doesn't make any freaking sense. And the Ukrainians, again, their constitution is very clear that this is perfectly acceptable because, again, their constitution was written knowing full well that the country has a history of being invaded by basically Russia and Germany at one point. But the Ukrainians build these things, these emergencies into their constitution for obvious reasons. Now, again, this is a sign from Putin that he feels that continued armed conflict is going to work in his favor, that he's winning on the battlefield. And if you're winning on the battlefield, well, why negotiate at all? And again, will the Trump administration actually have the spine to really stand up to Putin, to really punish him both on the battlefield and off the battlefield? That remains to be seen. But before we talk about the extremely controversial move by U.S. intelligence to start sharing classified intel with a former terror group now running Syria, I wanted to take a look and get this word from our sponsor. Anyone can find anything on the internet, even your name, home address, names of relatives, your job, even your phone number. I looked up my mom's name, and even though she barely uses the internet, her address, phone number, and age were all out there, accessible by anyone. It was pretty unnerving. This information is accessible because data brokers profit from selling information about you to robocallers, telemarketers, spammers, and anyone else that wants to learn more about you. That's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura will identify data brokers that are exposing your information and automatically submit opt-out requests on your behalf. They'll even opt you out of junk mail and telemarketing lists. You can use my link, aura.com/combat, to try for 2 weeks and see how many data brokers are sharing your information. The link is also in the description, or you can scan the QR code. Aura monitors your emails and passwords to see if they were involved in a data breach and exposed on the dark web. And then Aura gives you recommendations on what you can do. Aura confirmed that my personal data was exposed during the Equifax hack 8 years ago, and it's still floating around on the dark web. It's off-putting knowing my data has been out there for almost a decade. Aura's app also features a VPN, a password manager, and real-time credit and identity theft monitoring, internet parental controls, and protects your devices from malware. Aura has almost every internet safety tool you'll need in one app. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. If you sign up now, Aura will give you a 2-week free trial with my link, aura.com/combat. You'll be shocked about how much of your private information Aura finds exposed over those 2 weeks. So check my link to start your free trial in the description below or scan the QR code to get started. Now, let's take a look at the U.S. leadership sending classified info to the current regime in Syria. Now, here's the thing. This has been leaked by the Washington Post. It says the U.S. reportedly is sharing intelligence with the new Syrian leadership to counter ISIS threats. In just an insane case of the tail wagging the horse, the U.S. has begun sharing classified intelligence with Syria's new leadership, led by the HTS. Of course, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an Islamist group formerly designated as a terrorist organization. Guys, it was designated as a terrorist organization as little as 6 months ago, and now they are considered a legitimate ruling group in Syria, right? So, what happened here? You can see here is a screenshot of the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence.gov, right? Talking about the fact this is as of October 2022, right? So just a few, really just like, 30 months ago, they said Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a coalition of northern Syria-based Sunni Islamist insurgent groups that evolved from Jabhat al-Nusra of the Nusra Front of al-Qaeda's former branch in Syria, right? As we talked about early in the Syrian civil war, Nusra Front, ISIS, and other factions aligned for territory, revenue, and to fight against Assad. Some leaders shifted alliances. They ended up on opposite sides of the fighting. But what I think is also really important is this guy, the Abu Muhammad al-Jalani. Guys, this is someone who, again, cut his teeth in Iraq, killing government, right? You could see in the Iraq War, there he is in 2006. He said he was radicalized by the Palestinian Intifada in 2000 when he was 17 years old. And after appreciating the 9/11 attacks, he went to Damascus by bus to fight in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And he was a close associate, allegedly, of notorious Al-Qaeda in Iraq leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, one of the most brutal and vicious terrorists of that war. And he says he was only a foot soldier in Al-Qaeda against the American occupation, right? So he's killed multiple American soldiers, but don't worry. Now, guys, now he's our friend. Now he is a good dude. He's a nice guy. And the U.S. is going to totally share classified intelligence with him. There's no way this will backfire. And historically, it definitely hasn't backfired in the past, right? And so, of course, they say, well, U.S. intelligence recently helped thwart a planned ISIS attack on a prominent Shiite shrine near Damascus. Now, here's the thing. They say, well, the Biden administration is maintaining the group's terror designation while easing sanctions on Syria to facilitate humanitarian aid. But here's the real questions, is that you don't just wake up one day and say, wow, we're the CIA, and we are now going to start sharing intel with you, right? It's not that easy, okay? Because what do you have to have? You have to have contacts. You have to know those contacts are legitimate. You have to have a way for them to know you're legitimate, right? Because again, anybody can show up in Syria and say, I'm CIA. They're going to go, yeah, sure, buddy. No, you're not. Right? I can tell you for sure. In grad school, I had a good friend who took his spring break to Syrian or Kurdistani Iraq and just hung out with the Kurdish militia. German dude, light blonde hair, dude needed sunscreen on a cloudy day. Absolutely looked like the most European guy anyone's ever seen. But he got treated to the VIP treatment because everyone just assumed that the only European that would show up there would be someone linked to the intelligence community. And who knows? Maybe he was. But the takeaway to me was that you gotta vet if people are legit, because anyone can claim to be anybody. And so the fact is, this is not a relationship that's going to suddenly emerge, especially given the resources that they appeared to be able to marshal in the wake of their overthrow of the Assad regime, right? So again, I don't think that the CIA partnered with them directly. That's a little bit too, flying a little close to the sun, even for the CIA. I think instead, they reached out to their friends, the Turks, who are definitely willing to get dirty with some terror groups. And they said, listen, I think we should collab on this. So I think actually the Turkish intelligence is probably the conduit for these guys. But that doesn't mean it's any better. Because again, the CIA is like, they know what they're doing. Just because Turkish intelligence is likely acting as the telephone doesn't mean that the CIA isn't the person calling. And as we've seen in Afghanistan, this sort of thing backfires. Why? Because ultimately, extremists don't change their stripes. They certainly don't change their stripes as they get more powerful. Look no further than the Taliban, right? In the United States, we bankrolled Mujahideen extremists. We trained them. We gave them weapons, and then we let them run the country of Afghanistan, where they then fought each other for 10 years. And finally, the people that emerged were the Taliban, extremists committed to anti-Americanism, which is pretty insane given the fact that literally we brought them up. And so this Islamic extremist, you know what Aljalani means? It means Golani, right? It means literally he's like, I am of the Golani Heights, the Golan Heights, right? The contested region with Israel. And generally, if you're an anti-Israel extremist, it's in their ideological universe, they go, being an anti-Israel extremist, it's this exact same thing as being an anti-American extremist, right? And that's not me being like an Israeli apologist. This is just the reality on the ground. This is just how the ideology works. So again, you have the head of a terror group, killed U.S. soldiers, is now running the country of Syria, and the U.S. is out there being like, Good job. So cool. Great. Hey, man, heads up. ISIS is doing bad things in your territory. It's like, what are you doing, dudes? What are you doing, guys? Again, I don't believe for one second, just like the Taliban, when they took over Afghanistan, what did they say? They say, we're going to respect women's rights. We're going to respect the rights of religious minorities. We're not going to be the extremists that we were. And then, but here's the thing. Who's going to tell them to stop? They already beat the United States military. Who else is going to tell them to stop? Nobody. So again, 6 months later, they executed all the people that work for the government, something they said they wouldn't do. Then they banned women from being out in public. Then they banned women from wearing any clothing that wasn't the niqab. Then they banned all music, banned girls' education, did every single thing that their ideology demanded that they do, but that publicly they said, dude, we're not that guy, right? So when this guy takes over our country and says, guys, I'm not an Al-Qaeda affiliate. This isn't an Al-Qaeda a terrorist running a nation state. Guys, I don't know what to tell you. It 100% is. And these guys don't change their stripes. I'm a realist as they come. But this is not going to end well, right? This is not going to end well. You've given Al-Qaeda a state in the Middle East. Now, the reason I think you're seeing this is because the U.S. is finally waking up to a certain reality, and that is the reality of great power conflict, right? We've spent a lot of time, we spent a lot of money fighting insurgencies, and if there's one thing that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown us, it's that conflict between states is back on the menu, and the U.S. is starting to ask itself some tough questions, right? Now, the problem is that does the new administration have a real strategy? Well, the answer is kind of, sort of, maybe. And so on one hand, you have a Trump executive order, which I point out is not a law, right? The White House, Trump can sign documents that say whatever he wants. That doesn't mean that he has the legal authority to do so. We elect a president, not a king. So it doesn't matter that Trump signs an executive order that asks for a next generation missile defense shield, the so-called American Iron Dome, right? Now, some of this should feel familiar, right? He wants to develop space-based interceptors capable of destroying enemy missiles during their initial boost phase shortly after launch. Now, in order to create this, you would have to have space-based weapons, which seems like it might be a violation of the Treaty Against Militarization in Space. It's not clear that Russia respects this treaty, so I don't know if the U.S. still considers itself bound by this treaty as well. But this would also require, you may notice, the ability to strike basically any point, not on the ground, but very shortly after, right? Very close to the ground, anywhere on the globe, which is kind of terrifying, right? The actual statement of his executive order says the United States will provide for the common defense of its citizens and the nation by deploying and maintaining a next-generation missile defense shield. The U.S. will deter and defend its citizens and critical infrastructure against any foreign aerial attack on the homeland. That feels good, but is it possible? He calls it an Iron Dome for America, which is, of course, the name of Israel's regional missile defense system, but it does different things. Israel's Iron Dome is meant to stop Hamas homemade rockets, short-range missiles, right? The U.S. version is supposed to do something that it's not clear that it's possible, which is, again, to basically monitor the globe 24/7 and detect a missile, a ballistic missile, as soon as it's launched. This, of course, would mean that the U.S. would demand that all countries on Earth alert it prior to launching any kind of rocket. And this sort of thing is at the upper limit of what is possible. Again, you're talking about blanketing the globe here and then striking a ground target with less than an hour, right? Really tough stuff to do. You can see it's supposed to find it during the boost phase, and then during re-entry, track it during its glide phase and intercept it in the terminal phase. But that's hypersonic missiles. That's not conventional ballistic missiles. It's really, if it's possible, it's going to be unbelievably expensive. And the problem is just that, is that the Trump administration has two competing priorities. One is these kind of pie in the sky type things, right? Reagan thought it could make a laser missile defense system, the Star Wars system, but it couldn't. And we spent billions and billions of wasted government dollars on it. And then remember, by spent billions, I mean transferred those billions from the U.S. taxpayer in the form of government debt and tax revenue, and gave it to Lockheed Martin, Harris Corp, Boeing, and other defense contractors. That's all that was. And the defense contractors produced virtually nothing, but they sure cashed those checks. And so the fear is that this is another comparable in scale boondoggle, right? That won't really deliver a meaningful counter to any kind of threats, right? This is against just a non-threat, right? Because we have a way to counter large-scale nuclear missiles targeting the United States. It's mutually assured destruction. That is the 60-year-old system. And as we've discussed on this channel, it's actually scary because let's say you're China. Let's say you're China. You go, man, the United States, they're going to deploy a missile defense shield, and it's going to be so effective that it is going to turn our entire nuclear arsenal to scrap, right? Not one nuclear arsenal will get through, not one warhead will get through the day they flip the switch to turn it on. What then do you do with your nuclear weapons if they are about to become worthless? You deploy them. That is the fear, is that you start a countdown when you build this system, even if it doesn't actually work. If the Chinese believe there's a good chance it's going to work, or the Russians believe there's a good chance it's going to work, they may sit there and say, we have to stop this. We have to stop this from being deployed. And more importantly, we cannot let the Americans get this perfect shield, because their fear, the Chinese would say, is if the system turns on, the U.S. becomes protected under a bubble. That means their missiles can go out and destroy China or Russia, and our missiles cannot get in. And we have to hit them before they gain this ability. So this is, in some ways, could be interpreted as an escalatory measure. Again, I don't think so, because the odds of it being actually perfect and effective are basically nil. Again, it would require a massive defense undertaking. I'll never sit there and say the U.S. can't do it, but man, it would require a lot. But the problem is there's another set of equations happening right now in the U.S. defense establishment. And that is being led by this guy, Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby. Interesting name. He's actually a pretty smart guy, but he's proposing deep cuts to the Army to the tune of 21 BCTs. That is like, I think something like a half of the U.S. Army's ground force, and downsizing the European mission, right? Now, what exactly is this? Well, the answer is that Elbridge Colby is a nominee for the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Now, I point this out because Undersecretaries of Defense, especially when you have someone like Pete Hegseth in charge of the Pentagon, if he's smart, and I don't know Pete Hegseth, the person, but a smart guy is going to look and they're going to say, listen, if I'm in charge of this agency and I am a great public figure, then he goes, listen, my role is going to be 90% external. And that means that I need under me really mission and operations focused people. Because he says, I'm Pete Hegseth. I'm great in front of a camera. I should be giving briefings every day. I should be the public face of the Department of Defense. That is my best role. And that I need really good policy wonks. So if you want to know the future of the Department of Defense, don't look at Pete Hegseth. Look at his undersecretaries, because they're going to be the people that are running the actual Pentagon. Pete Hegseth, if he's smart, is going to be representing the Pentagon. And again, I don't have any reason to believe Pete Hegseth isn't like a basically smart guy who knows what he's great at. And he's great at being on TV, and he's great at being a public figure. Elbridge Colby is the opposite. This is a guy who is a strategy-first thinker, right? And what he wants to do is cut huge numbers of the Army's brigades. Well, why? Well, what he's saying is that the Army needs to spend about $70 billion less, and that with that combined with some other cuts to programs would free up about $40 billion a pop for the Navy and Air Force. Well, why is that? Well, the answer is because the U.S., he feels, needs to have a focus on military containment of China, what he calls a strategy of denial. Denial just means raising the costs of China pushing into a place, primarily Taiwan, because the costs would be too great for China to accept, right? The irony is China's strategy in Taiwan is the exact same thing. China's strategy in Taiwan says that the U.S. public will not tolerate the sinking of, say, an aircraft carrier or a few thousand American deaths, and that the public will outrage and refuse to defend Taiwan and other U.S. allies in the Pacific in the event that they take even a relatively small number of casualties. Again, 1,600 casualties, a sink of an aircraft carrier would roughly be like 1 day of operations in of Russia in Ukraine, for context, right? So how does this work? How does this overall theory? Well, again, this is someone who overall feels that China is seeking regional hegemony over Asia. Don't think that's terribly controversial. He also says that America cannot do everything. He says that, listen, America and there's some, I think he's kind of onto something here. I think that the United States, when in the 90s, we were the sole superpower. There was one country that was huge and super powerful, and no other country could compete. And so the United States could sit there and say, we can police the whole world, because we probably could, right? Because the Russian military lost in Chechnya in the 90s. Okay, that's how weak they were. Now, it's a different world. And China and its military are actually, they're not peers of the United States. They're sort of their own different animal. But it would take a lot for the U.S. military to beat the Chinese, right? They might even be able to do like the Ukrainians. They might even be able to destroy the entire Chinese military in being. But China and its manufacturing capacity and its huge population and its surplus of men is going to be able to field another army and another navy and put that to field. So the United States military, according to Colby, he argues that we can't try to win every war in the world. That's a way to lose every war in the world. He says we should focus on one thing, and that is strategically balancing against China, creating a military where the costs of antagonizing a U.S. ally in China or in the Pacific are simply too great to China. And so, again, he believes that the best way China could achieve denying U.S., basically targeting U.S. interests and allies in the Pacific would be attacking U.S. ally or quasi-ally, almost certainly Taiwan. He believes Taiwan would lead to a limited war and would seek to cause the least upheaval in the region, right? He calls on the U.S. to prepare for this scenario of a limited Taiwan war. But he says, listen, there needs to be a coalition of people who don't want to live in a world dominated by China, right? The land where you cannot say Tiananmen Square, the land where no one has freedom of speech, there are no votes, right? Do you really want to live in that world? Where the government decides what companies get to exist, and if your company pisses off the government too much, you and your friends get disappeared? That's a world dominated by China, FYI, right? And so he says, listen, I don't have a problem with the Chinese Communist Party or Xi Jinping, right? China's a rising power with a rational interest in expanding their sphere of influence and believe themselves to be aggrieved. That's all pretty true stuff. But the key is that he's like, listen, we have to focus. We have to choose to do one thing. And he's saying we need to choose to counterbalance China. And the fact is that in the event of an invasion of Taiwan or conflict with the Philippines or over the Spratlys or any other Chinese interest, the U.S. needs an Air Force and a Navy that is capable of fighting and winning. And the fact is, you couldn't fit 21 brigades in the island of Taiwan. You couldn't do it if you tried. And so he says, listen, we need to just find ways to take our existing DoD budget, because it's not going to expand, because the administration has said we're not going to increase government debt. We're trying to decrease the size of government. So he says we got to balance things. And he wants to cut 21 brigades, especially heavy brigades. And the reason I think this actually, this kind of makes sense, right? If you look at Ukraine, the heavy brigade combat team has gotten smoked. The days of the tank are over, right? There's a whole bunch of hand-wringing that, no, they could still use tanks. Tanks are still good. Dude, tanks have such a short lifespan on the battlefield of drones. They just do, okay? And they just don't last long enough to be worth it. And so you have this era of the mine and the drone just making tanks irrelevant. And frankly, tanks were irrelevant. IEDs made tanks irrelevant in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know what to tell you. Nobody was deploying Abrams. Not since about 2005 is the last time you saw an Abrams in the streets of Iraq or Afghanistan. So get rid of them, right? And if the army wants to fight and win, it's going to have to do something that it hasn't done in a long time, which is innovate, which is do things differently with limited resources. And striker brigades, same thing. He wants to get rid of some of the striker brigades. I could see that. Get the strikers out into mechanized infantry units. That's where the fight is now. Mech infantry, right? Even light infantry. You look at Europe and that's what you see, right? But there's a catch. The U.S. is going to focus on China and focus on things that can fight the Chinese. That means that in terms of countering Russia, that job falls to Europe. And again, I don't hate this. I've been saying it for years that the Europeans are asleep at the wheel. And that is even what the Europeans themselves are saying now, right? Russia, according to key European industry leaders, NATO is warning the EU, these are European heads of NATO, are saying, listen, Russia thinks they're at war with you guys. You have to start thinking like this is a fight. NATO's James Apaturi told the European Parliament, their hybrid warfare committee, that listen, there was a plot to kill Rheinmetall's CEO in July. It's the tip of the iceberg. Our intelligence agencies have found so much more. This is the Deputy Assistant Secretary General. And he's like, yo, Russia's hybrid warfare is sprawling, right? And yeah, he confirmed that the Russians wanted to kill the CEO of Rheinmetall. But there's so much more. He's like, there's so much more things that we can't tell you that Russia is trying to do, right? The Russia's using online recruitment, enlisting criminal networks, young youth extremists, or even migrants to carry out all sorts of sabotage and destabilization activities, while often crude in concept and execution, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be well executed because you're hiring a criminal to do it. They're just going to get arrested and put in jail for 2 years, right? The goal is to undermine European support for Ukraine, but it's not just the war in Ukraine. And he says, listen, the number of sabotage incidents like arson, train derailments, attacks on politicians' property, and attempts on the lives of key figures in the defense sector are increasing, right? Because again, Russia's doing them and they're getting no consequences. So, and Europe itself, right, as NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte said, Europe doesn't have a wartime mindset. They're just like, take it. They just are unbothered by this. They're unable. And Putin at some point is going to go, listen, the Europeans aren't going to mount a defense because they can't. Just like we talked about on this channel earlier. You know how much as a percentage from 2023 to today, 2 years, do you know how much the Europeans have increased their European production of artillery shells? 0. The Europeans have brought 0 production capacity online in 2 years. That's how bureaucratic, red-taped, utterly impotent the European is. People say Europe is a museum masquerading as a country, and it's true. The Europeans will do anything to avoid confronting the changing reality of their world, right? Do you know how many of the largest companies produced in the last 50 years are headquartered in Europe? 0, right? Europeans in 1950, their economy consisted of car manufacturers. You know what the European economy consists of in 2025? Car manufacturers. There's been no updates to the European economy, no updates to the European defense strategy. If anything, the Europeans are less capable of defending themselves than ever, because after the Cold War, they scrapped their militaries, underfunded them to an unbelievable degree, except for France, and spent it on social spending and handouts, right? And now that the Russians are knocking on their doorstep, they still are unable to muster the political will to even defend themselves. Like, the level of impotence is astounding, right? You'll defend themselves from the harms of a free market economy where sometimes people lose their jobs, right? God forbid somebody loses their jobs and has to find another one. God forbid somebody produces a company that produces an innovation, right? The Europeans, they see innovation and they regulate it out of existence as fast as possible. AI, regulated, right? Soda bottle caps. You can't just take them off. Oh, they make a mess. Clean it the fuck up, right? So the fact is that even with the Russians knocking on their door, they still are unable to produce one additional artillery shell. And maybe this is what it takes. It takes, right? They don't have to produce these artillery shells because they know that the Americans will defend them, that it's the Americans' job to defend them so that they get to spend their tax money on social welfare benefits. And then every European posts on Reddit like, I can't fucking believe that the Americans don't have the universal health care and fucking 8 years of unemployment benefits and da-da-da-da-da. And it's like, dude, we don't have it because we foot the bill for defending your country. Like, defend your own sovereignty, guy. You know? And then talk to us about why our country isn't that well run, because we continue to grow our economy at 3% a year, and the European economy hasn't grown in 10 years. So this is the kind of thing where I'm going to fire shots at this administration when they fuck up. But I think this may not actually be a fuck up. Again, what they can't do, and they're probably going to do, they seem to love flailing. This is not something you can do next week. You can't send out an executive order and go stand down 21 of those brigades. It's not clear that it's legal in the US, but it's also going to leave the Europeans even more flat-footed. They need to know, be like, listen, you have to prepare to defend yourselves. We are going to be withdrawing from the EUCOM mission. We do not have the brigades to do it. We have to focus on countering the largest global threat, China. So you, Europe, you have to find a way to train and equip a military that can assume this role. But you have to give them enough time to do it, right? 2 years, probably too long. But 12 months, 18 months, right? To say, listen, you've got to stand up more tank brigades. And that's something that I think is not unreasonable. Again, in the Cold War, when there were two superpowers, we of course said, listen, everybody's got to row on this boat. If you're big, strong like the United States, you row hard. If you're small like the Latvians, you also row hard. You just row in the capacity that you have, right? And that's the thing. Everybody should be dropping 2.5%, 3% of GDP. And we're just starting to see the Europeans wake up to it. But remember, they've been at war for 3 years. 3 years, guys, right? If you had a kid the day that Russia rolled into Ukraine, that kid is now complaining about the food. They are talking and walking and probably know their numbers. That's how long this has been. So anyway, that is my gripe with the Europeans. Again, I hope they get it together. I want a world where more democracies can defend themselves. Because democracy doesn't survive because of its goodness, right? Like, being a nice person doesn't stop you from getting robbed. If you want to not get robbed, you have to be able to protect yourself, right? You have to have locks on your doors, right? Being a nice guy, being kind to your neighbors doesn't deter thieves. Locks, bars, windows, the ability to protect yourself, those things deter thieves, and being a nice guy is good too. And that's what you want. You don't want to see countries that have commitment to human rights, to democracy, to freedom of speech. You don't want to see those countries get swallowed up by countries like China and Russia. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe button. That makes a difference. Thank you to Martin Braum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do it without you guys. I'll see you over on Combat Vet News for the next one. Cheers.